Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shelley Klein, historian and director of education at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our program on queering Holocaust studies. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to welcome our partner from Union Station, Michael Tritt, to say a bit about our partnership between MCHE and Union Station and Auschwitz not long ago, not far away.
Thank you, Shelley. Am I good?
You are good.
Okay. Well, welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. On behalf of all of us at Union Station, welcome to this important presentation made possible, as Shelley mentioned, by the collaboration between MCHE and Union Station's Auschwitz not long ago, not far away. It is our sincere pleasure to co-host this ongoing speaker series and invite you to participate in these important discussions. To date, over 231,000 people have either purchased tickets and visited the exhibition presented by Bank of America and here at Union Station through the end of January. From those guests who have visited, the exhibition has earned profound appreciation, as you might imagine, and a satisfaction score of over 95%, which is unheard of. Additionally, by the end of the run, we will have hosted over 25,000 middle and high school students at no cost to them nor their schools, thanks to a group of generous donors who are funding essential scholarships. If you haven't had a chance yet to experience this world-class exhibition and encounter with history, I encourage you to make reservations just as soon as possible. They are filling up fast. Now to backtrack a few months. When we first considered bringing the exhibition to Kansas City, we were especially moved by the Spanish producer's personal and professional mission to do something, and that term comes from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, which inspired the producer. And so we are doing something to educate, to engage, to empower, and to cause actionable conversation in the form of the exhibition, as well as these powerful speaker presentations. By the end of this lecture, we hope you also feel compelled to do something with the content you are about to encounter. Finally, our deep appreciation once again to our partners at MCHE. None of this would be possible without their passion and participation. Shelley and Jessica, thank you so much. Now, Shelley, back to you.
Thank you, Michael. Some of you may have previously joined us for our other programs that dealt with the non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and that was a topic that we were we're very adamant that we cover. Previously, we talked about the Roma experience in the Holocaust. We talked about the T4 euthanasia program, and we had a panel with those topics, as well as Dr. Sperlin talking about the queer experience in the Holocaust. It's very appropriate today that we are discussing this topic, as yesterday was National Coming Out Day, a day that we celebrate and raise awareness for the entire LGBTQ+ community. For so long, when we talked about the queer experience in the Holocaust, we really were only talking about a narrow slice of it, typically that of pink triangle victims or men who were convicted of having sexual relations with other men. And while this is an important piece of the story, it really did exclude and leave out a lot of the other experiences and persecution and trauma of others in the queer community. Dr. Sperlin's work encourages us to give a deeper, more thorough and inclusive reading and study of the Holocaust. So Dr. Sperlin is the professor of English and vice dean in the College of Business and Arts and Social Sciences at Brunel University in London. He's written extensively on the politics of gender and sexual dissonance. His book, Lost Intimacies, Rethinking Homosexuality Under National Socialism, is excellent, and I encourage everyone to give it a read. So it is truly my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sperlin, and I think we will learn a great deal from his presentation today.
Well, thank you so much, Shelley, for that wonderful introduction. I almost, forgot it was about me as I was hearing it, but thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And I would like to thank both Michael and Shelley for inviting me. And it was such a pleasure to hear about the exciting work that is going on in the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. And it is such a pleasure to be very much part of that. So thank you again very much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about my work in the area of queering Holocaust studies. I'm going to be a bit boring and read a bit, but then I'll stop because I want to stay within my time frame so that we have time for questions. But I'll also stop and speak informally and give examples and so on. The other thing is I'm suffering from a bit of laryngitis and I've been teaching all day. It's evening here in London, so it's a bit of an occupational hazard. So I may have to stop to cough or catch my breath or drink some tea, but please bear with me because I really want to be here and I didn't want to cancel, but I have one of the occupational hazards of being an academic because we all talk too much. Anyway, I just wanted to see if I could share my screen with you. I do have some PowerPoint slides. I hope everybody can see them. This is the longer title of my talk, which I noticed only the Queering Holocaust Studies appears in the poster because my titles tend to take up several lines and be very long. So, okay, if you can't hear me or anything, maybe Shelley can let me know and I'll repeat because I hope my voice doesn't fade out. Questions concerning the place of sexual dissidence in Holocaust scholarship have not been asked until quite recently in terms of how they inform our understandings of the historical and ongoing significance of the Holocaust. Now, what we do know is that published testimonies that appeared in the 1980s and 1990s by gay men and lesbians who were persecuted under National Socialism were valuable as historical documents that demonstrated the lived experiences and actualities of persecutions. But this work still remains somewhat marginalized from mainstream Holocaust scholarship. Now, when I started doing this work in the 1990s, I mean, I couldn't even get a hearing or get any funding because people simply did not want to hear about it. And people thought that this was an area of inquiry that was not appropriate to Holocaust scholarship, that it would trivialize the notion of studying genocide and the Holocaust. Dagmar Herzog, in her book Sexuality in Europe, a 20th Century History, notes that sexuality was burdened with enormous significance in the early 20th century, given the separation of sexuality from reproduction, which became apparent not only through the rising availability of birth control during this period, but through heightened expectations of erotic pleasure, particularly for women, and a general preoccupation with sexual orientation, sexual rights, and sexual norms. One would assume, therefore, that the significance of sexuality as a marker and mode of cultural organization in 20th century European history would certainly belong to the study of the Holocaust, to the extent that sexuality is a political category infused with social meaning. And of course, that touches upon the work of Michel Foucault and his history of sexuality. And my perspective in studying gay and lesbian victims of the Holocaust is very much informed by a Foucauldian perspective. Now, with this contradiction in mind, the fact that sexuality had so much meaning and there were so many shifts in the thinking of sexuality in the early 20th century, yet it wasn't really addressed in Holocaust scholarship. With this contradiction in mind, my talk today attempts to queer Holocaust studies through analyzing particular discursive and institutional practices of the Third Reich pertaining to racial hygiene, eugenics, anxieties around social degeneracy, and other nationalist goals in relation to the politics of sexuality under National Socialism. In my work, queering Holocaust studies implies neither the reduction of sexuality to a separate axis of investigation, nor to a problematic notion of a queer Holocaust, or as some people have called it, a homocaust. I mean, I think it's very dangerous to look at Nazi homophobia as a separate axis of oppression, but rather I see it as a way of broadening interpretations and understandings of the Holocaust by carefully rereading the historical record in order to highlight the precedent of a highly visible lesbian and gay subculture in the Weimar Republic in Germany, and gradual attempts by the Nazis to eradicate homosexuality deliberately and systematically from the National Socialist imaginary from the beginnings of the Third Reich. Now, examining the Holocaust through theorizing more explicitly and more systematically the politics of sexuality under National Socialism helps to point to blind spots or gaps in thinking based on the long absence of the history of Holocaust studies around the interrogation of state-sponsored homophobia, especially since homophobia operated in collaboration with other vectors of Nazi power. And that's quite important. Homophobia was intertwined or interlaced with other vectors of Nazi power around racial politics, around eugenics, around degeneracy, and so on. It must be recognized that for a long time, and until very recently, homosexuality was regarded as an inappropriate area for Holocaust research. This speaks in part to a historical conservatism toward the study of sexuality in the discipline, but it is changing now. And more importantly, to historical divisions within Holocaust studies in terms of understanding Jews as the primary victims of Nazi policies, given that they were destined for genocide, and attempts to understand other victims of Nazi persecution. Now, Michael Berenbaum succinctly frames the point in noting the position of Elie Wiesel, which acknowledges that while not all victims of Nazi atrocities were Jews, all Jews were victims by virtue of being Jewish, and that a focus on other victims might detract from the Judaic significance of the Holocaust, namely the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and the possible effacement of their memory, to the extent that specific references to Jews may eventually be overshadowed, undermined, or quite possibly erased in future narratives of the Holocaust if scholars and historians tend to focus on other victims or the total 11 million people murdered by the Nazis overall. The other position has been noted by Berenbaum, has been articulated by Simon Wiesenthal, and maintains that the Holocaust transcended the confines of the Jewish community and that there were other victims as indicated by the historical record. Now, I still maintain, as I did in my book, Lost Intimacies, which Shelley mentioned, that it's important to recognize the scale of persecution against Jews under National Socialist policy, in the name of maintaining white racial purity and superiority, and we have to also recognize the magnitude of the final solution. But we also have to realize that an understanding of other victims will deepen our understandings of the Holocaust and of Nazi fascism, given that racial ideologies also informed the persecution of gay men and lesbians. So it's not a separate axis of investigation, because Nazi racist policies also touch upon the reasons why gay men and lesbians were persecuted. And I think that panel that we did about a month ago on non-Jewish victims is very important, because again, it helps to broaden our understandings of National Socialism and the Holocaust. Now, I just wanted to give a little bit of historical context in the period before, particularly the Weimar Republic in Germany, 1919 to 1933, which was the period before the Nazis took over. And this period signaled a new social order in Germany, enabling a greater openness towards sexuality and a challenge to restrictive laws and social codes that were underway since the turn of the last century. The rising modernist movement in Europe attempted to shake off the vestiges of the past, particularly Victorianism, by searching for new ideas and new forms in literature, philosophy, and the visual arts, creating a climate of exploration and experimentation. Now, this spirit of experimentation and breaking free from received artistic conventions was reflected also in social reforms, which included new ideas that challenged social conventions around sexuality. Herzog points to the rise of burgeoning behavior and ventures into non-traditional sexual arrangements in the interwar period that began to proliferate in various parts of Europe. These arrangements included love triangles in artistic and intellectual milieus, which demonstrated the fluid boundaries and the ambiguities between the hetero-homo distinction, the primary discursive organizer of sexuality from the mid to late 19th century, and the rising social importance that was given to outdoor organizations dedicated to health reform and naturist nudity, particularly in Germany. Herzog specifically notes that post-World War I climate generally was one of openness and experimentation, unhinged from church teachings and bourgeois notions of respectability. This rising shift that brought about significant rethinking on complex issues surrounding marriage, reproduction, and intergender relations enabled a flourishing of gay and lesbian subcultures in the 1920s in Germany, in such cities as Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Munich, and Frankfurt. Another interesting aspect from the Weimar is the work of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld and his scientific humanitarian committee, which advocated for the scientific or the academic study of sexuality. Now, Hirschfeld, who is also Jewish, founded the Institute for Sexual Sciences in Berlin in 1918, which he directed until it was plundered and destroyed by the Nazis in 1933. The Institute attracted an international reputation for pioneering research that theorized homosexuality as congenital and constitutionally determined, rather than as simply acquired. So he pretty much followed Freud, who in the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality says that we must understand homosexuality as possibly congenital, as well as looking at environmental factors through which it may be acquired. So it's a matter of both. Nazi propaganda later on assumed homosexuality to be a vice that Jews had brought to the German state. And according to Rüdiger Lottmann, the Nazis erroneously conflated the scientific study of sexuality with the very phenomenon of homosexuality itself. So that if you were studying homosexuality, you must therefore be one. Most important, Hirschfeld began campaigning for the rights of homosexuals as far back as 1897 through raising public awareness of same-sex love and affectional bonds for both gay men and lesbians, and through trying, but not succeeding, to gain public support for the decriminalization of homosexuality based on the principle of mutual consent between adults through the appeal of paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. But unfortunately, he did not get that repealed. Now, a third influence on understanding the sexual culture of the Weimar was the group called Gemeinschaft der Eigenen, a later variation of the romantic male friendship tradition, or Freundesliebe, that had flourished in Germany between the mid-18th and the mid-19th century. Now, this is translated as for friendship and freedom. The Gemeinschaft der Eigenen, formed in 1903 by Adolf Brand, opposed the new meanings being attached to male homosocial bonds and affectional attachments between men by the rising influence of medical discourses, including Magnus Hirschfeld's distinction between the friendships of heterosexual men and erotic same-sex attachments. Whereas this group, the Gemeinschaft der Eigenen, tried to conflate and bring together the friendships between men and the possibilities of homoerotic attachments. At the time of its founding, the Gemeinschaft der Eigenen glorified love between male friends as a way of rising above bourgeois mediocrity and materialism. The group saw the struggle for gender equality as a feminization of society in opposition to Hirschfeld, who regarded equal rights for women to be in the interests of homosexuals. So Hirschfeld was an early feminist. This group was not. The group's idea that healthy culture was inherently masculinist and based on male bonding, however, implied elitist, racist, and misogynist leanings, showing that homosexual movements may not always have been aligned with progressive social movements. The Gemeinschaft der Eigenen believed that German genius could be saved from decadence and decline by a homoerotic male culture. While both groups agreed on the importance of repealing paragraph 175, the relationship between Gemeinschaft der Eigenen and Hirschfeld's committee and his later Institute for Sexual Science was often fraught with disagreement about the social meaning of homosexuality. In fact, as already implied, the importance that the Gemeinschaft der Eigenen placed on male bonding, conventional masculinity, and the maintenance of strict gender distinctions, as opposed to the fluidity between the genders, aligned it more closely with the rising ideals of German nationalism fermenting under the Weimar Republic, and eventually with National Socialism, except for the group's celebratory views of male homosexuality. So the Weimar period was a very interesting period, and what is also important about it is the lesbian subculture that thrived in such cities as Berlin, that was never before present in Germany, with its own clubs and meeting places, and also a wide variety of periodicals dedicated to lesbian culture, including Die Freundin and Garçonne, which were published during the Weimar years and enabled a growing sense of lesbian community. Now, a book was published, Berlin's Lesbische Frauen, by Ruth Margarete Rolig, or it was also published in French as Les Lesbiennes de Berlin. And in the book, you can see that on the left-hand part of the slide that the introduction was written by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, wherein he argues that lesbians are not psychologically ill and are neither socially inferior nor criminal, because the rising sexologists were beginning to put these ideas across, but are often of great intelligence and artistic ability. And of course, the lesbian subculture was also attached very much during the Weimar to the New Woman movement as well, the idea of women being very independent and not defining themselves in relation to men. And Marlene Dietrich in the lower right-hand corner was very much part of this movement as well. Okay, now I wanted to show you just a very brief video. I hope it will work. I don't have any footage of the Weimar Republic in Germany, but I do have a video footage of the lesbian subculture that was happening at the same time on the left bank in Paris, where there was also a culture of lesbian creative art, where women would come from Europe and from other parts of Europe and from America, from Britain, to discover their creativity alongside other women. So I'll just show this. Let me see if it will work. And if you can hear it.
I think I got a message yesterday.
Okay.
We don't see it, we just hear it. Are we supposed to see it?
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you hear it?
We can hear it. I just didn't know if we were supposed to see it as well.
Oh yeah, can you see it?
We can't see it. I think it maybe is opened in another window, so you might have to stop the share and share.
Oh, okay. Let me check. Okay. Okay. Oh yes. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Tous les vieux qu'on nous connaisse, qui moins de folles promesses, au fil de l'eau le rideau va compter, au dis-moi nos épouvantés, et donc les bras qui m'entraînent, en écoutant les sirènes, me laisse vague et perdu de bonheur, mon cœur auprès de ton cœur.
The city of Paris has often been portrayed as a seductive woman, both mistress and muse to generations of male poets and artists. But not all those drawn to the city of light have been men. At the dawn of the 20th century, creative women flocked to the left bank, responding not only to the beauty of Paris, but even more to its promise of freedom. They created a community which made it possible for them to follow their passions into a life filled with art and literature. Neither mistress nor muse, Paris became a haven for a new kind of woman.
Okay. So, I mean, that was just interesting in terms of what was happening in Paris. And of course, later when the Nazis invaded France and took over Paris, of course, that lesbian subculture very much disappeared. But it was interesting to see that there were writers there such as Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas and Duna Barnes and H.D. and many others who were part of that lesbian subculture in Paris. And I do mention that because lesbians often for a long time were ignored because most of the historical record addressed the persecution of gay men. Okay, I'm going to come back to my slide now. And I think we stopped here. Okay. Now, addressing the Nazi period, what do we know from the historical record? And I always like to start here because I come from a place where I started this work in the 1990s, that people did not believe that there was even a systemic or systematic record of persecution against gay men and lesbians. So what I did is I tried to, in researching it, try to present excuse me, a thread that would go through the Nazi period and look specifically at specific persecutions and specific institutional practices that that served to marginalize and to persecute gay men and lesbians. And you can see that it's quite systemic. I mean, just looking at, 1933 to 1934, the Campaign for a Clean Reich, the Night of the Long Knives in 34, the revision of the paragraph 175, 1935, and so on. So it is quite systemic. And I wanted to talk about a little bit about each of these issues very briefly. Now, what we do know is that as soon as the Nazis came to power in January of 1933, through the Campaign for a Clean Reich, I mean, after the Weimar, they thought things went a bit too far, got a bit too decadent, and now we have to clean things up. Measures were taken to ensure the efficacy of the normal-abnormal split with regard to sexuality, which the new government believed had been undermined under the previous Weimar Republic. The Nazis began with the official banning of pornography in February 1933, the raiding, looting, and destruction of books and manuscripts in Magnus Hirschfeld's Sexual Science Institute in May 1933. And there they are looting the books. And also the closing of the gay bars in 1933 and 1934, including a very famous one in Berlin, the El Dorado, which was closed by the police on 5 March 1933. Now, fortunately, Hirschfeld was out of the country at a conference when this happened, and he was warned not to come back because he was also Jewish, and this would put him in danger. But they did destroy so much of the research and burned a lot of the books that were in the Institute's library. Now, it's important not to look at these early forms of power, as well as those that followed, as targeting homosexuality in isolation without its deeper imbrication with gender and racial politics. Nazi displays of power were deliberately performative and staged to induce fear as a way of restoring masculinity, which was believed by many German nationalists to have been lost under the German defeat in World War I and the further weakening of Germany through economic depression. Now, this required, in the view of the Nazis, a tightening of gender roles and a reinstantiation of the traditional gender binary as a way of restoring masculinity as forceful, virile, and willful. This meant that women were to be driven out of the world of work and that their independence was to be curtailed, and so that they could concentrate on domestic and family life. Repeated impregnation was regarded as a man's assertion of his masculinity and as his right. Now, masculinity, or really what I would call a kind of hyper-masculinity, was inseparable from the identity of the Third Reich, especially within Nazi leadership, which feminized Jews and homosexuals by representing them in ways that made them stand out in stark contrast to the militaristic and highly gendered character of Nazi rule. This is precisely, I think, where gender, sexuality, and race intersect in Nazi politics, and it's crucial to understanding the persecution of gay men and lesbians under National Socialism. As George Moss points out, stereotypical depictions of so-called sexual degenerates, such as homosexuals, were transferred nearly intact to so-called inferior races, who inspired fears of unbridled sexuality, to the extent that Jews and other races deemed, quote, inferior, were marked by excessive, uncontrollable sexuality. In other words, both homosexuals and Jews were thought to use their uncontrollable lusts and passions as weapons against the morality of the folk and the superiority of the Nordic race. So that was one thing, the campaign for a cleaner Reich. Now, the next year, the following year, we see the racialization of homosexuality again to understand the Röhm Purge of 1934 and Nazi intolerance for homosexuality within its own ranks. On 30 June 1934, Ernst Röhm, who was the leader of the SA, or the Sturmabteilung, the Nazi stormtroopers, who was also homosexual, was murdered by the SS. Now, also murdered during what was called the Night of the Long Knives were other known homosexuals in the SA, and those in the SA leadership who were perceived to threaten the consolidation of Hitler's power. Now, these murders were also politically motivated as well, because there were power struggles between the SA and other factions of the Nazi leadership. But the murder of Röhm in particular indicates that homophobia was used to justify the persecution of homosexuals as enemies of the state on the grounds of disloyalty and the subversion of national interests. So homosexuals would put their own personal or private interests ahead of the state. And you see that same trope appearing in America under McCarthyism, where homosexuals were again seen as enemies of the state and could not get security clearance to work, for instance, in the State Department for that very reason. And those clearances were not lifted until the Clinton administration. So they were in place for a very long time. So this idea of homosexuals as enemies of the state and not really being loyal enough and so on do have, their traces in the Nazi era as well. And homosexuality could also be used as a form of denunciation of the regime's political enemies. Now, Röhm's assassination marked a decisive turn in the intolerance of homosexuality within the Nazi ranks and performed by Nazi men in power. And it would be highly questionable to theorize the hypermasculinity that Nazi men in power demonstrated, and the homoerotic potential within these closely knit homosocial bonds as forms of latent homosexuality among Nazi men. So the bonds were homosocial. It was very masculine and both a group of men, and they were very tightly knit homosocial bonds. And there was probably homoerotic potential happening there. But some work in Holocaust scholarship tends to conflate homosexuality with fascism. And I think that's a bit problematic and maybe going a bit too far. Many gay men, yes, they were very perhaps turned on by the leather boots and the strict military masculinity and so on. But I think to see Nazi officials as latent homosexuals or to link homosexuality with Nazism is going a bit too far, because it elides the simultaneous disavowal of same-sex desires and prohibitions against their enactment within fascism, as well as the impact of the Röhm Purge and Hitler's later decision in 1941 to denounce what he referred to as the plague of homosexuality by prescribing the death penalty for those in the SS and secret police who were convicted under paragraph 175. Now, this does not preclude the possibilities of sexual liaisons between men within the elite ranks of the Nazi power, despite the strict prohibitions against them. But it's important to bear in mind that these close-knit same-sex bonds were managed socially under powerful strategies of homophobic surveillance, discipline, and regulation. So they were homosocial bonds, they were bonds between men. There was possibly a homoerotic charge, but then to go from there and to say that there was homosexuality, or that, that Nazi leaders, especially the stormtroopers and so on, were latent homosexuals, might be going a bit too far. As Eve Sedgwick reminds us, fascism is distinction not for the intensity of its homoerotic charge, but for the virulence of the homophobic prohibition to which that charge, once crystallized as an object of knowledge, is then denied knowledge and thence most manipulatively mobilized. Now, the Nazis also seemed very much aware of the ambiguities, and I hate to give them credit for anything, in defining homosexuality through private sexual acts, because they recognized the social mediation of sexuality and the signifying practices through which same-sex desires and identities were encoded. In other words, you couldn't define homosexuality just by catching people in the act. Now, the original paragraph 175 of the Bright Penal Code, which came about in 1871, criminalized unnatural sex acts. So it was an unnatural sex act committed between persons of the male sex or by humans with animals. They conflated it a bit with bestiality, and was punishable by imprisonment. So that's the original 175 in 1871. But on 28 June 1935, the Nazis amended paragraph 175 and it became paragraph 175A. And this, they changed the idea of the act, which I think I put in bold print if you can see, an unnatural sex act. They changed the wording to a male who commits a sex offense. So they changed sex act to sex offense. So the revived paragraph 175, the revised version, allowed for imprisonment of up to 10 years or not less than 3 months for men who threatened to commit acts of violence toward other men in order to compel them to engage in a sex offense, for men who abused relations of dependence based on service, employment, or subordination, for men who seduced younger men under the age of 21, for men who committed sex offenses with other men in public, and for homosexual prostitutes. But the use of the term sexual offense not only designated an intercourse-like act, which could include oral penetration, anal penetration, or intercrural sex, which is sex between the thighs where the penis is inserted between the thighs of another man. It could include those things, but also could include any kind of sexual gratification in the presence of another man, including physical contact between men with sexual intent. So it could include embracing and kissing and so on. It also made expressions of feeling between men and homoerotic fantasy and homoerotic thought criminal offenses. The revision of paragraph 175 to 175A was a shift from sodomy to other expressions of same-sex desire, which could include men kissing, embracing, fondling other men, and homosexual fantasies that were articulated in private conversations, in diaries, in letters. They could wiretap your phone, and they could hear you speaking about your love for another man. All of these things were enough, were sufficient to secure a conviction, and also to secure an arrest, and in many cases to secure a conviction. And then 175B, they separated the bestiality code. Now, it's important to note that there were persecutions against lesbians, and I'll talk about that a bit later, but lesbian sex was not specifically encoded into law in either paragraph 175 or in its subsequent revision. There were persecutions against lesbians, however, even though it was not specifically encoded into law. But there were debates among Nazi jurists as to the legal status of sex between women, and some did argue for its inclusion in the criminal code. A transcript from the minutes of discussions by a subcommittee on population policy in 1936 demonstrates that some Nazi officials believed that population policy was not threatened by female homosexuality in response to proposals for its criminalization by some Nazi jurists, under the assumption that if a woman was seduced by another woman, she would not necessarily withdraw from normal heterosexual relations, and she could still be useful in terms of population growth and development. The final juridical decision did not come until 1942. So people were very worried, lesbians especially were very worried that 175 could be used against them. But in a letter from the Reich Minister of Justice to the Reichskommissar for the occupied Norwegian territories of Oslo, a letter was written that states, quote, homosexual activity between women apart from prostitutes is not so widespread as it is among men, given the more intense matters of social intercourse between women. Women who indulge in unnatural sexual relations are not lost forever as procreative factors in the same way that homosexual men are. For experience shows they often later resume normal relations, end quote. So it wasn't specifically encoded, but I think we have to be careful to assume that that doesn't mean that lesbians were not specifically persecuted under the Nazi regime. So you can see we have the Campaign for the Clean Reich in 1933 and 1934, the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, the revision of paragraph 175 in 1935, and then in 1936, the following year, there's also something interesting. And this shows that Nazi sexual politics intersected with its racial and gender politics in National Socialism through Heinrich Himmler's establishment of the Reichszentrale zur Bekämpfung der Homosexualität und der Abtreibung, or the Reich Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion, within Gestapo headquarters in Berlin on 26 October 1936. Now, the establishment of a special department within the Reich Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion was part of a process of heightened inscription and prosecution of homosexuals through what Jeffrey Giles refers to as centralized police intervention, made possible through the extension of paragraph 175. So now they needed a wider office because it was easier to prosecute homosexuality. They needed a wider office and more people power to process people suspected of being homosexual. But the fact that homosexuality and abortion are linked and they're in the same Reich office links homosexuality, as I've been arguing, more prominently with racial and population politics. Homosexual sex and a high number of abortions were blamed for stunting population growth. Homosexuality was thus coupled with abortion, as both had deleterious effects on the birth rate among Aryan Germans. The most important task of the Reich Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion was to quantify, index, and compare relevant data to keep track of those suspected and convicted of homosexuality, with personal details also obtained on their partners. And they kept links with the Gestapo insofar as an offender's homosexuality represented a serious threat to population policy and public health. In the period between 1937 and 1939, for example, 90,000 men and youth were registered as suspected homosexuals or as presumed partners within this Reich office. They had files on 90,000 men. An unpublished report of the Reich Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion indicates the number of men sentenced for crimes under paragraph 175 or 1750 was about 43,000 between the year the Reich Office was founded in 1936 and the outbreak of World War II in 1939. Denunciations of homosexuals by friends, family relatives, and co-workers also aided the work of the Reich Office. So this foregoing evidence suggests that the Nazi persecution of homosexuals had its basis in its policies around racial hygiene, and that homophobia was not a separate sphere of Nazi power. That is to say that Nazi homophobia was not the simple or unconscious hatred or fear of homosexuality alone, but was rooted in its population and in its racial policies and population goals. The defeat of Germany after World War I and its further weakening through economic depression exacerbated the production of discourses on eugenics and racial hygiene, which developed out of scientific racism of the late 18th and 19th centuries. In the early 20th century, even under the Weimar Republic, despite the liberalization of attitudes towards sexual variation, complementary discourses on degeneracy developed steadily within medicine and psychiatry and were used as diagnostic tools for those who fell outside accepted norms of social respectability. Along these lines, the Nazi state, both juridically and medically, viewed Aryan homosexuals as population zeros who contributed to Germany's declining birth rate by not fulfilling their obligations to the reproduction of the race and the welfare of the nation. And they were also seen as criminals who seduced and corrupted the young. In medical literature, going back to the end of the 19th century, images of Jews and male homosexuals often run parallel and were portrayed, and both were portrayed as prone to hysteria and feminized through such descriptive characteristics as tone of voice and bodily movements more appropriate to women than to men. Thus, the social inscription of male Jews and homosexuals was not only racialized and medicalized, but also gendered and denied masculine agency. For white Nordic homosexuals, homosexuality represented a visible mark of un-Germanness. And for homosexuals from racial groups that were already marked as social outsiders, their sexuality was marked as a further indicator of racial inferiority. So there is a link here to racial politics. And here in a German journal, Der Stürmer, we have a microscope with a petri dish. And here we have all the pathogenic germs that can infect society. So in the circle is what the microscope is pointing to in the petri dish. And these are all the enemies of the state. And this is in black and white, so you can't see the colors, but you can see dollar signs, which are capitalism, hammers and sickles, communism. You can also see Stars of David, Jews, pink triangles for homosexuals and other groups that were seen as infecting society. So this foregoing evidence suggests that the Nazi persecution of homosexuals had its basis in its policies around racial hygiene, and that homophobia was not, oh, I'm sorry, I already did that part, was not a separate sphere of power. Now, the varying forms of actual persecution of homosexuals under National Socialism, in addition to changes in the law and the destruction of gay culture and community, are already well documented. What we do know is that in the 12 years between 1933 and 1945, that's the entire Nazi period, there were about 100,000 men prosecuted for homosexuality in the Nazi criminal courts. So about 100,000. Close to half, that is between 46,000 and 50,000 men, were convicted and initially given a prison term, depending on the nature of their crime. 6 months for mutual masturbation, a year or more for oral sex, but harsher punishments for anal sex, seducing youth, pedophilia, and recidivists. Also, judges often acted on their own discretion based on their interpretations of morality and healthy German people. This was not the case for Jews. I mean, their destiny was very different under the National Socialist imaginary. Now, Rüdiger Lottmann, who researched archives at the International Tracing Service in Arras in Germany, found that homosexual prisoners in camps who are identifiable by the pink triangles that they wore on their uniforms were found in more significant numbers at concentration camps in Buchenwald, and Buchenwald had the highest concentration of gay male prisoners, but also in Dachau, Dora-Mittelbau, Flossenburg, Mauthausen, Grossrosen, Natzweiler, Neuengamme, Sachsenhausen, Stuttgart, and the men's camp at Ravensbrück. So those were the ones that had high numbers of gay male prisoners. He found the number of homosexual inmates varied at any given moment in any given camp, because the records were not as complete as they were, for instance, for Jews who were interned in the camps. Lottmann estimates that between 5,000 and 15,000 homosexual prisoners were incarcerated. So during the Nazi period, so 100,000 were prosecuted in the courts, 46,000 to 50,000, about half, were convicted and initially given a prison sentence, and later some were sent to camps, and that number is between 5 and 15,000 that we normally estimate at about 10,000, and that the death rate was about 60% of those numbers, though we cannot know the exact number of deaths. So, I mean, we can't compare this to 6 million Jews, but again, it's not a number game. I mean, one murder is horrific. Okay. Okay. Homosexual prisoners in the camps, we know, were also tortured, forced to have sexual intercourse with prostitutes to show that they were, quote, cured. And at Buchenwald in particular, which had the highest proportion of homosexual prisoners, those convicted of homosexuality were subject to medical experimentation. We know that some 200 involuntary castrations were performed in Buchenwald just between 1938 and 1940 alone. The Nazis in 1942 feared a possible outbreak of typhus fever, both in Germany and at the front, and they developed an experimental station for typhus fever at Buchenwald. And a considerable number of the subjects tested were gay men who had been working in the penal battalion in the rock quarries, for instance, and they were actually injected with typhus fever or with underdeveloped vaccines for typhus, and died very agonizing deaths. At Buchenwald in particular, one Danish SS doctor, Dr. Karl Varanet, decided to introduce a sexual hormone implant into the groin region of homosexual prisoners which would release additional testosterone into the bloodstream to cure deviant sexual desire in men. But this had terrible results, including heart failure and festering inflammations of cell tissue. Because homosexual men interned in the concentration camps held a very low status within the camp hierarchy and were given very dangerous and physically exhausting labor to perform, they were subject to various forms of medical experimentation as human guinea pigs. They were subject to beatings by camp guards and other prisoners, sometimes resulting in death. They were ostracized within the camp community, given no positions of responsibility, no capos, and they encountered hostility from other prisoners through the influence of societal homophobia. They were also subject to execution, though not systematically, through firing squads at first and gas chambers, and they were subject to a higher mortality rate among other non-racialized groups. But the inconsistencies in the Nazi persecution of homosexual men, while linked with its racial policies and the framing of juridical practices and institutions for casting homosexuals as enemies of the state, and while not reducible to the final solution, should not obscure the historical and material realities of homophobic terror, violence, and murder that gay men suffered under Nazism. Now, I'd also wanted to say a little bit about the persecution of lesbians, and then I'll try to wrap up and conclude. Holocaust research has quite consistently stipulated that lesbians were not as systematically persecuted by the Nazis as were gay men, largely because lesbian sex was not criminalized under paragraph 175 or its revision. But this view, I think, warrants challenging because it risks further misrepresentations or elisions of the victims of Nazism, and also because of a broader precedent in Holocaust research that has not paid sufficient attention to the unique experiences of women because of a historically heteromasculinist bias in narratives about Holocaust victims and survivors. In queering Holocaust studies, it is important, as I've argued elsewhere, to ensure that the axis of sexuality not override and obscure the axis of gender in order to allow the specificity of lesbian difference as distinct from gay men, as distinct from heterosexual women to emerge. Now, we know that in Austria, before the country's Anschluss to Germany, they had paragraph 129(1)b, which criminalized all forms of same-sex sexuality, regardless of gender. And this 129(1)b remained on the books in Austria between 1938 and 1945. And carried a potential prison sentence of 1 to 5 years. Now, of course, when Germany overtook, or when Austria was annexed to Germany, paragraph 175 sort of overrode that. But lesbians could still be taken away in Austria for violations of 129(1)b, which resulted in intensified prosecutions, countless deportations to camps, and numerous deaths. And this statute remained on the books, long after World War II, and remained in the books for a long time after that, until the 1970s. Okay, under the Third Reich, the Nazis saw women not marked otherwise by ethnic or racial difference, physical or mental handicap, party membership, or political or religious beliefs as predestined for motherhood and the domestic sphere, and therefore as subordinate to men. As Robert Proctor notes in his book, Racial Hygiene, the Nazis saw white Aryan women as reproductive rather than as political beings. Specific to lesbians, the enforcement of gender norms were tied to heteronormative sexuality and potentially placed women in danger if they did not conform to Nazi ideals of femininity. Claudia Schottman, who has collected writings by lesbian survivors of the Third Reich in her book, Days of Masquerade, which I showed you, I think, in the first slide, reflects on the lived experience of Elizabeth Zimmerman to illustrate the gender-specific socialization of girls and young women and how this centered on their obligation to be sexually passive and to remain chaste. Because sexual passivity was conflated with conventional femininity as an effective Nazi ideology, rein bleiben und reif werden, to remain pure and to mature. The process of discovering one's lesbian desires could be spread over a much longer period of time than was the case for gay men, because of course women, as part of their socialization, were taught to be subordinate to men. and of course to become mothers, to become wives and mothers. The enforcement of gender norms for women was of course very much tied to Nazi population goals to raise the birth rate in Germany, which had declined in the period from the beginning of the 20th century and to 1932. So Proctor notes that in 1900, the German birth rate was 36 births per 1,000 people. By 1932, there were fewer than 15 births per 1,000 people. So the birth rate went down from 1930 to 1932 by about 50%, and this was very concerning to the Nazis. There's also evidence of Nazi propaganda speaking on an awareness of lesbian existence and its threat to population quotas. Das Schwarze Korps, which is an official journal of the SS, indicated in 1937 that, quote, the true woman suffers if not married, not because she lacks sexual intercourse, but because she lacks a child and has not answered her calling to motherhood, end quote. And of course, I've translated that into English. In the case of lesbians, therefore, non-heteronormative, non-procreative forms of sexuality seem to be erased or dismissed as inconsequential, whereas for gay men, sexual intercourse or intercourse-like acts were encoded specifically into penal law. At the same time, the reproach of masculinization was often used to intimidate women who dared to break out of traditional gender norms and heterosexist social structures, as this would be perceived as a threat to the stability of the regime. Signs of overt masculinity, such as hairstyle, clothing, or outward behavior, enable the policing of women's gender roles, and less overtly, their erotic lives. A conduct book that was published by a Nazi's women's organization in 1934 interpreted masculine identification in women as, quote, degenerative signs of a foreign race, which are hostile to procreation and thus destructive to the people. Healthy races do not artificially blur the differences between the sexes, end quote. So do you see how it all comes back to race? Because the Nazis debated whether or not to criminalize lesbian sex in the German Penal Code, and given Nazi population politics and implications for women, it would be erroneous to assume that lesbians were not subject to Nazi persecution, given that the juridical indecisiveness and early ambiguities around lesbian sexuality could have created the conditions for persecution. Most lesbians were not prosecuted as lesbians, however, but as asocials. Now, this term referred to a broad, diverse category of those individuals the Nazis considered not to be living up to Nazi ideals of proper citizenship and national belonging, but who had not committed any major crime and were not members of an inferior race. And this included prostitutes, vagrants, those who had violated laws prohibiting sexual contact between Aryans and Jews, and so-called resistant women who failed to live up to the regime's social demands, such as its demographic goals, many of whom in that group of asocial women, of resistant women, were lesbian. But as Amy Ellman notes, the heterogeneity of this group, marked by a black triangle, so lesbians didn't wear the pink triangle, but a black triangle, makes it difficult to render lesbians legible, unlike in the case of gay men who were identifiable by the pink triangle they had to wear at the camps. But the refusal to stop working, the resistance to heterosexual marriage, the failure to bear children, and certainly having effective and erotic ties to other women and refusing to be defined in any relation to men, did place many women under threat, particularly if they were lesbian, despite the lack of criminalization. Harassment, persecution, despite the lack of criminalization of lesbian desire. These forms of resistance often did result in intimidation, harassment, persecution, and possible arrest and deportation to a concentration camp. One woman who was a Luftwaffe assistant working in Oslo between 1943 and 1945, named Helene G., was deported to Butzau camp for rejecting the sexual advances of a Nazi officer, and she was arrested for subversion of military potential for not doing her national service by having sex with this Nazi officer. So she was sent to the Butzau camp, and she notes that lesbians were kept in a separate block from men and from other women in the camp. And while she was there, the SS guards set the interred Russian and French prisoners of war, the male prisoners of war, were set upon the imprisoned lesbians, and the guards instructed the male prisoners to, quote, fuck them up good and proper. To give a final example, Elizabeth Wust, or Lily Wust as she was known, the wife of a Nazi officer, underwent torturous interrogation in 1944 as a way of forcing her to deny that she had sexual relations with Felice Schragenheim on the right, a Jewish woman who was initially arrested in 1941 as an asocial and then rearrested by the Gestapo as a Jew after living underground after her release. Schragenheim died in Bergen-Belsen in 1944. Wust admitted that no lesbian love had existed between the two women, since, as Ellman notes, the admission of a sexual relationship with another woman would have meant internment in a concentration camp. And it wasn't until 1991 that Wust corrected the historical record, ending decades of agonizing silence by telling her story to an American journalist, Erica Fisher, who published the book Amy and Jaguar in 1944. This is Amy et Jaguar, une histoire d'amour Berlin, 1943, which is the French version, but there's also a version in English. And this was published in 1994, based on the lives of Wust and Schragenheim, which was also made into a film of the same name. Wust died in Berlin in 2006. So lesbian existence still needs to be more meaningfully enfolded into Holocaust research, which cannot be accomplished by traditional historical approaches that rely on received forms of archival and textual evidence alone, or by assuming that lesbian existence and persecution during the Third Reich can be understood in the same ways we understand the persecution of gay men. Rather, we need to understand much more comprehensively the ways in which some women, labeled as asocial and persecuted for the resistance to multiple forms of social and political domination, including the enforcement of fixed notions of femininity through marriage and procreation, restriction to the domestic sphere, and sexual subservience to Nazi officers, women in this group could possibly have been lesbian, even though their sexuality may not be immediately apparent or legible in the historical record. We often have to look for what is not said directly, for what is said indirectly. Or sometimes for what is absent. It is important that historical archives are reread for the possibilities of lesbian existence and read alongside the recorded survival testimony, only some of which I could describe here. This may open up new questions that challenge the heteronormative frames of reference through which we largely understand the past, as well as the heteromasculinist bias that for so long has dominated Holocaust scholarship. And in my final moments, I just want to talk about some of the contemporary effects of Nazi homophobia. Now, we must realize that homophobia in Germany did not dissipate after the defeat of the Nazis at the end of World War II, as the stigmatization of homosexuality far outlived the collapse of the Third Reich. While Nazi official racial policies ended, homosexuality remained in the penal code as a criminal offense for sex acts occurring between consenting men over the age of 21, legally still punishable by arrest and imprisonment in the Federal Republic of Germany, the former West Germany, until 1969, in the German Democratic Republic, the former East Germany, until 1968, and it remained a punishable crime in Austria until 1971. German leaders in the immediate post-war years believed that Nazi proceedings against homosexuals were legally and socially justified. And the conservative governments that followed the war tried to restore domesticated heterosexuality as part of the search for post-war normalcy with the support of church leaders. Most important, a document that I found at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., indicates that under the Allied military government of Germany following the war, some homosexuals were forced to serve out their prison terms, regardless of the time spent in concentration camps for their sentence. So this is distinct to this group. If they did not complete their sentence in concentration camp, or first they had to go to prison, then to concentration camp, after the war, many were sent back to prison. Can you imagine after living that time in concentration camp and then having to go back to prison to serve the remainder of your sentence? That is something that's very distinct to this group. And others were re-imprisoned for renewed infractions against paragraph 175. In the 1950s and 60s in the German Federal Republic, homosexuals continued to be prosecuted under paragraph 175. What we know is between 1950 and 1965, there were 45,000 convictions for homosexual offenses. The same, almost the same as the 12-year period in which the Nazis were in power. Most importantly, under the Reparation Act for those persecuted under National Socialism, which became law in the Federal Republic of Germany in 1956, reparation in the amount of 50 million German marks was paid by the mid-1970s as compensation to Nazi victims who were incarcerated in camps. But the act did not speak to the illegalities of detention for those in non-political categories, which included homosexuals and asocials. The narrow definition of the political only applied to conscious and active opposition to the Nazis and those who suffered religious or racial discrimination. In the Nuremberg trials, where former Nazis were persecuted, there were no crimes on record committed against homosexuals by Nazis. Now, it's very important in conclusion to note that Nazi homophobia must not be reduced to a temporary aberration in history or to a separate vector of Nazi power, since homophobia was deeply embedded in material practices under specific sets of social, historical, and ideological conditions before, during, and after the Nazi regime. Because remember, it was still a crime during the Weimar period as well. We have to also consider the further medical pathologization of homosexuality in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, that was published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952, where homosexuality was listed both as sociopathic and psychopathological. The DSM-2 came out in 1968. It softened its stance a little bit by saying that, okay, it's no longer sociopathic, but it's still psychopathological. And they listed it under other sexual deviations such as fetishism, pedophilia, exhibitionism, and so on. And these are some of the terrible monsters that promulgated this view. But it's interesting that these views were put into magazines in the 1960s, such as Life and Newsweek, that found their ways into middle-class American homes. One way to detect a homosexual, according to one psychoanalyst who was part of this DSM group that pathologized homosexuality, was that gay men could be identified by wearing fluffy sweaters, tight khaki trousers, and tennis shoes. And here you see two such men in Central Park getting odd stares from another couple. Here you see a man sitting on a rail in Los Angeles, but I didn't put the caption underneath in this issue of Life magazine, which reads, "A homosexual in Los Angeles sits on a rail." And then you have these black and white pictures with beautiful, color photographs this is an ad for coffee for Sanka, which reveal happy heterosexuality. So it's quite deliberate in the ways in which these discourses found their ways into popular culture. Now, in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association made a decision to remove homosexuality from the DSM. They kept ego-dystonic homosexuality, which meant that if you were aroused by same-sex feelings but didn't want to be, that could still be a category. And they inserted gender identity disorder in childhood, or GIDC, as a new diagnostic category for children who exhibited too much characteristics of the opposite sex, particularly effeminate boys. DSM-3R in 1987 deleted ego-dystonic. DSM-4, 1994, did not list homosexuality, but did list GIDC, and interestingly listed homophobia as a mental disorder. In DSM-5, the current edition 2013 lists gender dysphoria in children, but the characteristics are still very similar to gender identity disorder. Once homosexuality was removed from the DSM, however, the responses to the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the early 80s were shaped by deep-seated prejudice surrounding not only homosexuality, because the disease was largely associated with gay men and metaphors of sexual perversion, but as Cindy Patton reminds us, they were also shaped by discourses around race, gender, class, and addiction as the pandemic grew. In the present day, many post-colonial nations cast homosexuality aside as a white Western aberration that is alien to their indigenous cultures, and homosexuality remains in the penal codes as a legacy of European colonial rule. Contemporary homophobia and transphobia continues to remain directed at those least capable of resisting it, such as children and gay and lesbian youth in all parts of the world. The prejudice is attested to the fact that gender dysphoria remains a diagnostic category in the current DSM-5, which historically has pathologized pathologized cross-gender identification in children, especially in boys, and has conflated it more indirectly now with possible homosexual outcome. And conversion therapies that are still legal in many parts of the world are part of this violence against children. Amnesty International and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child report that the intimidation of and violence toward gay and non-gender conforming youth can range from homophobic and transphobic bullying by peers and teachers to brutal chastisement and rape within the family and within communities, all of which have long-lasting and often devastating effects on a young person's sense of dignity, of worth, and dignity. According to Jonathan Friedman, historians need to rethink dominant categories of historical understanding so as to find voices that have been submerged and thereby contest the desire among other historians for unambiguous and unified meaning. Future scholars studying the Holocaust can deepen its meaning and shape its ongoing significance by approaching historical sources with new questions about sexuality and gender, while being attentive to the blind spots and the gaps in the historical record, and by illuminating the ongoing ways in which homophobia intersects with other forms of power and continues to shape contemporary societies and cultures. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention and for staying with me. I'm sorry I went a bit over time. I had a bit of trouble with the technology.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Let's get back here. Hopefully we'll have some good questions here. I think it's always important when we are talking about this period to, like you started in Weimar, and I think that's so important because it's almost impossible to understand what's happening in the Nazi period without looking back at what had the new norm sort of that were beginning to be asserted in that really exciting Weimar period. We have a couple of questions about that. Could you tell us what happens to Dr. Hirschfeld after his institute is raided? What happens to him in later life?
Well, I don't know much about what happens to him. I mean, he remains, I mean, he doesn't return to Germany, but of course, the effects of having his life work plundered like that and his research just completely wiped out did fall very heavy and did fall very hard on him. And of course, being Jewish, he tried to, get as far away from the Nazis as possible. A lot of lesbians, it's very interesting, went to France, and then of course when the Germans occupied France, so there was difficulty there. But I mean, a lot of his research, I don't think he published very much after that because of the trauma of having his research just completely wiped out and the dangerous situation it put him in as a result of being both Jewish and being gay.
And what would you say during this period, the early period, of the Nazi regime, or even Weimar, what was the average opinion, the opinion of an average German in terms of gender and sexuality? Is this something was, average people were talking about? Is this more of an urban phenomenon?
I think it's probably more of an urban phenomenon. People were very much open in the cities to it. In the countryside and in rural areas, there was still things were still a bit conservative. And even during the Weimar period, I mean, I don't want to make a problematic rural urban distinction, but generally in the cities, there was more of an openness because these were the areas where writers and people involved in the arts and so on, and modernist writers and artists were gathering. But there was an undercurrent, particularly later in the 1920s with economic depression and so on, that things were getting a little too out of hand and that things needed to become back to normal. So there were a lot of discourses on the normal versus abnormal distinction that were even starting to show up during the Weimar Republic. So we mustn't assume that the Weimar Republic was just complete sexual freedom and all of that, because that was very much promulgated in very urban and bohemian kind of circles, but not only in Berlin and in German cities, but in other European cities as well. But there were calls for things to get back to normal, and of course the Nazis did pick up on that when they came into power.
And once, so we have prosecutions of paragraph 175, there's definitely an uptick when the Nazis come to power, certainly more when they revise 175. How does the war impact their eagerness to prosecute men under 175?
Well, during the war, once oh, I hear somebody's dog barking. Once the war started, the Reich office for the Reich Central Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion closed down, and because the manpower was needed for the war, and it went back to the police and the Gestapo and the Central Police to look after prosecuting gay men. So during the war, I mean, there were still, gay men and lesbians in concentration camps all the way through. I mean, I think Felice Schragenheim died, in the year before the war ended, although she was first imprisoned as lesbian or as asocial and then as lesbian. But the prosecutions continued during the war. Even when there was a fear of an outbreak of typhus, I mean, gay men became the subject of typhus experiments and were injected with typhus or with underdeveloped vaccines as a result. So it was still seen, I mean, people were still prosecuted. It didn't result in any sort of fallback in terms of the prosecution of gay men. And it wasn't until 1942 that the decision was made not to include lesbian sex in the law. But of course, lesbians were still prosecuted for being asocial, for not living up to ideals of Nazi femininity and so on. So it did continue straight through during the war. I don't see any evidence that that there was any sort of gap or anything in prosecutions, except that the Reich Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion did close down for a while.
Thank you. One thing in your book, Lost Intimacies, you do a really interesting reading of Anne Frank. And I wonder if you might be able to speak a little bit about how you queer that story and how that speaks to this ability of reading against the grain in order to better find these hidden stories.
Yes, well, I mean, the work on Anne Frank was very interesting. And of course, there's been interesting readings of her life, because we tend to heterosexualize her and see her as a young girl who's, interested in boys and so on. But some of her work has been read as the possibility of the awakenings of desires for women as well, particularly, her friends and things. And we don't know for sure. And of course, it's very difficult to pinpoint, especially on a young girl, sexuality, either being straight or gay or lesbian or whatever. But there is some interesting work to suggest the possibility. And I think that relates to what I was saying about the historical record, that we really need to go back and reread again with fresh eyes, now that we have such tools as queer theory, for example, or other lenses through which to read the historical record. Now, I'm not saying that Anne Frank was lesbian, but we may be able to open the possibilities for seeing her through different lenses, through certain clues, through certain narrative strategies that are in her work, and also her rebelliousness and her sense of independence relates a lot to what I was saying about the kinds of things that the Nazis did not like to see in women. And I mean, if she had grown up and lived, she might have been classified as asocial.
Thank you. It's such a great example of this, the skill of reading against the grain and reading against sort of heteronormatizing. And I think that's really important to do. Could you maybe speak a little bit about the reclaiming of the pink triangle? So something that was used to brand people, and then having a real change in gay culture and queer culture to be a symbol of pride.
Yes. Well, of course, it was in its time, it was a degenerate symbol. It wasn't something that you wore proudly. When you were in the camps and you had the pink triangle, I mean, that automatically signified low status. It automatically signified that you could be bodily abused and raped and all kinds of things, because gay men had such a low status in the camps. But this was gradually reclaimed, like the word queer, as a symbol of pride, and also as a historical symbol of the most, I guess, the most organized pogrom against homosexuals, and taking that pink triangle as a sign of defiance and of resistance to oppression, a never again kind of in your face kind of strategy. So similar to the word queer and to other things that have been reclaimed, takes away the pejorative aspect of it, and reframes it as a symbol of pride, as well as a symbol of survival, and as well as a symbol of what do you call it, of coming together, and to fight ongoing forms of homophobia.
I think it's the connection between the pink triangle as this unifying symbol is very interesting in terms of memorialization, because so many of the memorials that have been recently put up to commemorate queer victims often use this symbol of the pink triangle. On one hand, it does speak to our modern consensus of it as this unifying symbol. On the other hand, when we think about how it's been handled in terms of Holocaust history, it really seems to only speak to that one victim group. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that in terms of memorialization, or what they've done with the Berlin Memorial, but just how we can encourage inclusivity in our memorialization process.
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question, because the pink triangle, and I think and of course, what's interesting is in the camps, I mean, sometimes people would have, different triangle, or they would have a combination if they were interred for different reasons. So maybe a pink and, I mean, another color triangle as well, because what the it's kind of a bit fraught, because you want to preserve the specificity of the meaning of the pink triangle, that it was used, a symbol of persecution of gay men under National Socialism. But you don't want to lose the intersections with the other symbols and triangles and stars and so on that people wore, because this was part of a much larger system of identifying so-called enemies of the state. And of course, there were triangles of different colors, and there's charts that, I think Jehovah's Witnesses wore purple and so on. So it's very important to see that this was one symbol of solidarity, perhaps, and which is the way that it's used, the way that it's reframed now, but not to lose sight of the intersection with other groups who were also regarded as enemies of the state. So we need to see it as part of a larger system of oppression in the Holocaust, and not only focus on we need to keep the specificity of the pink triangle, because it did refer to the persecution of gay men, but not only focus on that, and focus on the system of inscription, which was the different triangles and the Star of David and so on, that marked people as enemies of the state. And it was, and I think one thing that binds everyone together is this notion of racial purity, the racial, and especially the racial politics of the Third Reich, to incorporate this white Aryan race. And gay men and lesbians were part of that in terms of the population politics, in terms of eugenics and so on. I don't know, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that category of the overlapping category of asocial is so interesting. And I recently learned that I think it was just in 2020 that the German government recognized asocial as a category that could be that could receive reparations. So it's again, yes, a reminder of this ongoing process and recognition. Yes. And as you pointed out, especially with gay men who survived and had to serve out their prison sentences, and then all of the stories we've missed out on from people who did not want to share their experiences because fear of re-imprisonment or further persecution. So I mean, I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yes. Oh, and I see someone in the chat Holly has given a link to Hirschfeld's life and his work, and has links for further research, Making Gay History. Yes, thank you very much for that. That looks very interesting, because I would be also very curious to see how Hirschfeld led his life, after what happened to him through his, well, he wasn't really exiled, but he couldn't go back to Germany afterwards. So that's very interesting. I think we've answered some of the questions. I mean, Nick Dean says, does the historical record speak to the awareness of the average 20th century German individual regarding homosexuality and queerness? Well, I don't know if it speaks to the average person. It's kind of hard to do that, but generally, not everyone was homophilic in the Weimar Republic. I mean, some people did believe, and remember that homosexuality was still a crime from 1871, so it was still on the record even during the Weimar Republic. But attitudes were changing, and I think the Weimar represents a slight shift in attitudes, not only toward homosexuality, but toward sexual norms in general. But I think what happened later with economic depression and so on is that, as always what happens in those times, that people became much more, it's time to get back into, into the order of things. It's time to, stop all this fooling around and get serious and so on. And that happened toward the end of the Weimar, which the Nazis were able to step in and speak up to, almost, quite matter-of-factly, perhaps, and almost, right on cue. At the end of your talk, you spoke about the importance of studying the Weimar and Nazi periods in order to learn how their policies influence governments today. How do you see the policies of governments around the world today toward queer people? Are there governments with inclusive policies that can serve as a model? What countries should be watching for human rights violations? Well, that's such a wonderful question. There's so many questions within that. Government policies do vary in different parts of the world. I don't think any governments particularly are particularly celebratory of LGBT rights, although they do it in order to be inclusive and so on. Are there governments with inclusive policies that can serve as a model? Well, there are probably some, I mean, perhaps, but it's hard to say because it depends who's in power. I mean, I would say Canada might be one, the Netherlands certainly, but then with very conservative, parties coming in, it kind of questions things. For human rights violations, well, yes, we should be watching many countries in the post-colonial world. The post-colonies in Africa, for instance, there's a lot of interference by evangelical missionaries who are bringing back these sort of religious views of homosexuality. And of course, this is being difficult in terms of changing the law to get rid of the penal codes that are in post-colonial nations that actually came about during colonial rule. Now, what happened is that the European colonizers, Britain, France, and so on, have since decriminalized in the 1960s, but those laws have remained in post-colonial countries long after independence. So, and of course, in certain countries of the world, particularly as some in the Middle East, the punishment for homosexuality can be a death sentence, depending. So, I mean, it's very important to continue to watch for human rights. As a result, I did speak in the UK Parliament about this because they wanted to extend their notion of development aid for sexual health, because when they give aid for health in developing countries, the only thing they give aid to in the British Parliament is contraception and getting women in rural areas to hospital in time to give birth. There's nothing on homosexuality or the rights of gay and lesbian people in terms of access to healthcare. And people in Parliament said, well, many MPs said, well, they already have laws against homosexuality, so there's not much we can do about that. But when I told them about these homophobic laws that actually were instituted under British colonial power, then the British government has a responsibility to try to get those laws decriminalized. And they did take it to the Australia Conference of the Commonwealth a few years later. And I think when I spoke in Parliament, it was 2011, and I think in 2012 or 2013, they did bring this up, that all countries in the British Commonwealth should get rid of homophobic laws. But unfortunately, it did not pass. There weren't by the vote. So it is very important to keep a watch on countries that are violating. Are there governments with inclusive policies toward queer people today? Yes. I mean, in the EU, this is a major point of contention. But we must, I mean, this is a major point where LBGT has actually been written into the Human Rights Act of 2004. And at my university, I helped to draft new policies that would have LBGT inclusion. But you have to remember that just because it's a change in law, the juridical law changes, that actual material practices remain far behind, and that there's a gap between what is prescribed in law and what is actually happening on the ground. In South Africa, they had a new constitution at the end of apartheid that gave rights across the board, not only for race after the terrible policies of apartheid and racial violence, but also for LBGT. But just because that law is there, I spoke to a drag queen in South Africa, and she said, well, it's nice we have the Constitution, but if there's some nut with some idiot with a knife in my throat, what am I going to do? Say, here's the new Constitution, you can't do that. So there's always going to be a lag between what's prescribed in juridical law and actual material practices. And somebody says, look at the behavior of Russia. Well, yes, there you are again. It's really cracking down on LBGT rights. I don't see anything else in
I think we've maybe answered all of them. I'm so pleased that you brought some of this discussion into the present, especially the end of your presentation, because I think it's really important to realize that legally, this is an ongoing discussion in terms of rights and combating discrimination. And like I said, thinking about National Coming Out Day being yesterday, we need to keep present how this fight is very much still a part of our own world, even though discrimination looks very different. It's still a fight we need to work on. And the last thing, yes, is if you could give us some recommendations for further study.
Yes. Well, there isn't all that much, that's out there, although much more is coming out. Let me just see if I have a list. Yes. I would recommend a good place to start is, if you're interested, is some of the testimonies that have come out that I showed you on the first slide. So I think Claudia Schottman's book, which is called Days of Masquerade, is very interesting because it looks specifically, she interviewed lesbians who were still surviving in the 1990s about their experiences. There's also a book by Richard Plant called The Pink Triangle, The Nazi War Against Homosexuals, which gives a very a nuanced view. So let me see if I can type some of these in the, so Richard Plant, Claudia Schottman. You see what I'm typing, is that coming out? And a book by Gunter Grau, who looks at, he's taken a lot of historical documents and has translated them and put them into a collection called Hidden Holocaust. And that's a very interesting book. And then Rudiger Lottman, who I mentioned, is also quite interesting. Rudiger Lottman, who has also, and there's a book the Holocaust Memorial Museum put out about the whole, it's a very comprehensive volume that's come out, and he's got an essay in there. But also there's even a more recent version of an essay called the, what is it called? The Companion to Holocaust Studies. And this is edited by, oh, I can't think of their names now. Oh, it's coming to me. Oh, I'll think of it in a moment. But there's a book called The Companion to Holocaust Studies. And this is the most comprehensive. It has about 40 chapters. And I have a chapter in there on my work. And there's some other chapters. And this gives an overall intersectional view of Holocaust victims, which I think is important to look at so that we just don't, well, again, we have to look at the specificity of queerness and queer victimhood in the Holocaust. But we also have to look at the wider picture. Oh, Simone, the editors are Simone Vigoletti and Hillary. And there's the collection in there. And then of course you can read my book, Lost Intimacies, if you want, which only looks at, what's in there is a lot of what I've is a lot what I've talked about today. But it's very interesting to look at, I think, the early testimonies. Another person who's written his own testimony was a Frenchman named Pierre Ciel, and that is written in English and translated. And there are many others. So those are some good books to start for further study. And then look in the bibliographies, and they will lead you to other chapters. Other work, Jeffrey Giles has written mostly just on the history, but it's not very well theorized. And I think we not only have to look at the historical record, but we have to try to theorize what it means, and also look at what it means for how we read and how we interpret the past.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful talk, this nuanced look at this particular history, and all these great recommendations. Thanks to everyone who tuned in to join us today, and hopefully we'll see all of you on another presentation. Our next presentation in the Auschwitz Speaker Series will be on October 26th at 6:30 p.m. down at Union Station, and it will be Sam Kassaw on time capsules under the rubble, the Ringelblum Archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. So hope to see everyone there. Thank you again to Dr. Sperlin, and everyone have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much. And thank you again, Shelley, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Keep in touch. Bye-bye.